Welcome my friends, this is Maniacal Incorporated and this is the first in a series of videos looking at medieval Irish history in Crusader Kings 2. I'm going to examine the dynasties and political structures that made up the island, how these are presented in the game, and some things that I'd like to see included in Crusader Kings 3. In this episode I'm going to take a look at Ireland in the 769 start date, but before doing so there are a few things worth noting. First of all, Ireland never came under Roman rule. There is a story that the 1st century governor of Britain, Agricola, hosted an exiled Irish prince by the name of Untitled Chapter, and there is some evidence that legionaries may have landed in Ireland to restore him to power. But Agricola was recalled to Rome in 85 AD, and upheaval within the empire meant that Ireland was spared from a full invasion. Christianity arrived in Ireland sometime prior to the early 5th century, but was heavily influenced by the legal practices and traditions of the Irish. There is speculation that in CK3 we will see the Irish following Insular Christianity, which represented distinctive customs practiced in Ireland and Britain which were at odds with those of Rome. These included things like the method for calculating the date of Easter and the style of tonsure worn. Ecclesiastic power was structured around monasteries instead of dioceses, and the position of abbot was hereditary, held by the family that had financed the monastery's construction. Most interestingly for CK3 players are the marriage laws, which survived attack by church reformers up until the Norman invasion. Law tracts make reference to primary wives, secondary partners and concubines, and divorce was common and easily attained by paying an honour price to buy the spouse out of the marriage, meaning that powerful kings would marry and divorce at will as political conditions changed. Speaking of which, the final point to take note of is the system of kingship in medieval Ireland. The lowest kings ruled over a single tua, roughly equivalent to a barony in CK2. Above these sat overkings which ruled at county level in game terms, and above these again sat provincial kings. As for succession, there is still some debate as to how exactly this was carried out. It appears likely that during the life of a ruling king or after his death, the Dervina, or close kindred, 3 generations of patrilineal descendants of all previous rulers, elected from amongst themselves the Tánaiste Rí, from which the anglicised term tanistry derives. So, in the absence of Roman rule, Ireland developed distinctive political and legal structures from those which were followed in much of Western Europe at the time. In later episodes, we'll see how this made it near impossible for a single king or dynasty to establish united, centralised rule over all of Ireland. But we'll also see how it led to a culture and to structures which were resilient to external takeover, remaining so even after the total conquest of the island. It is believed that in prehistory the island of Ireland had been split into 5 provinces, and that their tribal rulers were displaced by newer dynasties which had largely consolidated their control by the 7th century. By 769, the earliest start date in Crusader Kings 2, some of these had broken up into smaller kingdoms, creating a heavily fractured political scenario, and in this episode I'm going to look at the dynasties that ruled over the most important ones. We'll start in Connacht. The Khan of the Connacht is Con Céad Cathach, Khan of the 100 Battles, a legendary High King of Ireland said to have ruled in the early 2nd century. Meaning descendants of Con, the name Connacht was given both to the province and to the dynasties that came to power there. One of the most important was the Íomhruin. They would split into multiple branches which dominated Connacht, and from the Íomhruin I would descend the O'Cruthóir family, later anglicised as O'Connor, who would hold the High Kingship on the eve of the Norman invasion. Another branch would rule the kingdom of Breffni, later becoming the O'Rourke, and while the Ivonia were not related to the Connacht, they would be given a fictional pedigree, linking them back to Con. Prior to the 6th century, branches of the Connacht pushed into the neighbouring provinces of Ulster and Meath. They would call themselves the Nail, claiming descent from Niall na Gaelach, Niall of the 9 Hostages. He was a brother of the founder of the Íomhruin, and legend says that Patrick, later the patron saint of Ireland, was one of the slaves captured on his many raids on the west coast of Britain. Before the Nail incursion, the north of the island had been ruled by the Ulla, from where the province gets its name. They feature prominently in Irish mythology. In Abhainn Macha sat the legendary King Conor MacNessa, and Táin Bó Cúailnge tells of how the boy warrior Cuchulainn defended Ulster from the combined forces of Connacht and Munster. But by the mid-700s, when the Táin was being written down for the first time, the Ulla had been pushed to the very northeast of the province. Across the channel from Ulla stretched the kingdom of Dalriada, though there are no references to it in Irish records for a generation after its conquest in the 740s. Legend has it that Dalriada was founded by Urc Mac Ucha, a descendant of Conora the Beautiful, who succeeded his father-in-law, Con Céad Cahach, to the high kingship. From Urc, the later MacLaurin and MacGavran dynasties would descend. At its height under Édain MacGavran in the late 600s, Dalriada controlled land in both Ulster and southwest Scotland. Dalriada would play an important role in the spread of Insular Christianity. Exiled from Ireland because of a DMCA takedown notice, Columkill was given the island of Iona and built his great monastery here in the mid-6th century. 100 years later, Édain, an Irish monk from Iona, founded the religious settlement on Lindisfarne at the request of the King of Northumbria and became its first bishop. The status of Dalriada is not clear around the mid-700s and beyond, but it's suggested that they merged with the Picts to form the Kingdom of Scotland, and I'll look at the strong ties between medieval Ireland and Scotland again in the episode covering the Battle of Clontarf. The epithet Niall of the Nine Hostages is believed to reference hostages which were given by the Argyll in recognition of his overlordship. While much of their kingdom was stripped away by both the northern and southern Inéal, they did retain one valuable asset, the ecclesiastical city of Armagh, which contained the monastery believed to have been founded by Patrick himself. As Inéal power grew, so too did that of Armagh, which was then one of a number of ecclesiastical centres fighting for supremacy over religious affairs in Ireland. The two main branches of the northern Inéal claimed descent from two of Niall's children. From Conall Gulban, the Kennel or kindred of Conall took their name, settling in Tir Conall, while Tir Owen was held by the Kennel Owen. In 734, the Kennel Owen secured the over-kingship of the northern Inéal, while at roughly the same time, Clan Colman gained supremacy over their rival dynasties in Meath. They claimed descent from another of Niall's children, and for the next 2.5 centuries, the Kennel Owen and Clan Colman rotated between themselves the over-kingship of all of the Inéal, represented by the title Rí Temró, the King of Tara. Legend held that Tara had been an ancient city from which the gods, the Tuatha Dé Danann, had ruled the island, and where the Lia Fóil, the Stone of Destiny, had called out when stood on by Con Céad Cahach, recognising him and his descendants as the kings of Ireland. Thus, by holding the sacred site of Tara, the Inéal could lay claim to the kingship of all Ireland. While later pro-Inéal writers would describe the kings of Tara as high kings, it was the mid-800s before any of them took hostages from Munster, and few others would repeat this achievement, meaning that their rule was not island-wide. There wasn't even unity of purpose within the Inéal camp itself, with the rival northern and southern branches warring constantly against each other. Another block on establishing a united kingship of Ireland was the respect given to the compromise reached between Con Céad Cahach and his nemesis, Mug Nuada. They divided the island along the Iasca Riada, running from Dublin to Galway Bay. North of this line was Le Cuin, Con's half, and south was Le Moga, Mug's half. This theoretical division continued to have great importance for the Irish, and in 997 it served as the basis of an accord between the King of Tara, Mal Shachnail MacDonald, and the King of Munster, Brian Boru. The southern counterpoint to Inéal rule was the Kingdom of Muin, later Munster. By the late 600s, the Onokht had displaced the previous ruling peoples, forming into several branches which would contend for the over-kingship of the province. From the early 800s onwards, the most dominant branch was the Onokht Castle, named after their capital at the Rock of Cashel, where the kings of Munster would be crowned, and they would later become the McCarthys, ruling Munster with the O'Briens until the Norman invasion. The Onokht named themselves after a legendary ancestor, Owen Moore, whose grandfather was Owen Tailach, Owen the Splendid, though he was also known by another name, Mug Nuada, the servant of the god Nuada and the mortal enemy of Conn Céad Cathach. We can see that his son, Owen Moore's father, was Eliel Olive, and unusually for figures this early in history, his wife is identified. Her name is given as Saive Nic Conn, Saive, the daughter of Conn, and there are no prizes for guessing who that's a reference to. Owen Moore was a grandson of both Conn Céad Cathach and Mug Nuada, the two men who had divided the island between them. While the Onokht often proved a thorn in the side of Inéal ambitions, after the death of Cahal Mac Finguine in 742, it would be 100 years before another member of the dynasty would challenge for the High Kingship of Ireland, and with the establishment of Viking settlements in Limerick, Cork and Waterford, there followed a period of severe instability, resulting in their loss of the Kingdom of Munster to the Dalgash in the mid-900s. As the ruling dynasties of Line and Osroige did not claim descent from Conn of the Hundred Battles, we can now take a look at how the powers of the island and beyond linked back to him. The Inéal and the Connachtha actually share a much closer common relative, Ocha Mugbadán, Ocha the Slave Lord, who was father to Brian and Niall of the Nine Hostages. This tree also shows another son, Urk, ancestor of the MacLaurin and the Macgavrain, but that Urk was actually the son of a different Ocha, and if connected to Conn, it was through Conn's daughter Saura and her husband Conora the Beautiful. The Dal Fiachra Sui would claim descent from and name themselves after Conn's younger brother, and part of a text called The Expulsion of the Daesha records how a member of this family settled in David, giving rise to a number of Welsh dynasties. An Irish presence in the region is attested to by Ogham stones, and settlers from Leinster arrived in North Wales in the 4th and 5th centuries. So from Conn and Fiachra's father Félimíl Rachmar descended major dynasties in Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and his father, according to legend, was Tuathail Teachmar, who went into exile after his father the High King was deposed. The Roman historian Tacitus makes mention of an exiled Irish prince in Agricola's court, and the 17th century Annals of the Four Masters, compiled from earlier works, state that Tuathail Teachmar returned from exile with an army and claimed the High Kingship in 76 AD. There is even evidence of a Roman fort at Dublin from this time period near where he is said to have landed. While Tuathail Teachmar is likely fictional, it's possible that the Roman restoration of a deposed king as a pretext to a full invasion of Ireland served as the basis for the later legend. Now to look at the two remaining entities on the island of Ireland. In the 7th century, the previous ruling Dal Byrne were restored to power in Osroige or Ossory, which was then part of Munster until the mid-800s, remaining briefly independent before joining Leinster. The Dal Byrne looked to an early 1st century king as the founder of the dynasty, with his father giving his name to the region, though there is some suggestion that Ossory means people of the deer. And finally, we come to the province of Line, or Leinster in English. Consisting of only a single county in CK2, Leinster had constricted under southern Inéal pressure, which may have led to population groups being pushed out of the region and migrating to Wales. This region was dominated by two dynasties who competed for the over-kingship, the Dunlina in the north and the Cinshilig in the south. While power had been contested by them and a few smaller dynasties, after a crippling defeat in 738, no member of the Cinshilig would rule Leinster for another 300 years. Instead, three branches of the Dunlina, descended from three brothers, would rotate the kingship between them, until instability in the aftermath of the Battle of Clontarf led to their collapse. In CK2, however, while the de jure Duchy of Leinster consists of Line and Osroige, the Dunlina are completely absent, and the county of Line and its history should be regarded as just representing the southern lands of the Cinshilig. In the 1066 start, due to their importance in the Battle of Clontarf, a few members of one of the Dunlina branches are represented, the Foileáin, being the family of Brian Boru's wife and his brother-in-law who would die fighting against him. The Cinshilig, however, will have a much greater impact on Irish history, as the Norman invasion began in 1169 at the behest of their deposed king, Diarmait mac Murchadh, who offered his kingdom in return for aid. The Cinnsealaigh were founded by Aine Cinnsealach, who waged war against Niall of the Nine Hostages over the payment of a cattle tribute that had first been imposed on Leinster by Tuathail Teachmar, and while there is no consensus on the exact events, all of the sources agree that Niall was killed by Aine's son Ucha. So that brings to an end my look at Ireland in the 769 start. I've made no mention of Dublin in this episode, and while there may have been a small settlement there in the mid-700s, it's not until the arrival of the Vikings that it gains its national importance, so I'll take a look at that in the next episode. Now to look at a few things that I would like to see included for Ireland in Crusader Kings 3. If Insular Christianity is available in CK3, then the most essential inclusion, the absence of which will render the game utterly unplayable, is Celtic tonsure. 3D models with Celtic tonsure, or I will riot. Concubinage is already a feature of CK2, but hopefully we'll see the availability of divorce to give insular Christian rulers a more reliable way of reforming alliances and maintaining their dynasty than the current approach. I'm actually going to do a separate video looking at what we know about religion in CK3 and how insular Christianity might fit into this. We can see that for much of its history, Ireland was heavily fractured politically, and this is represented on the game map. But we also see that there were a number of over-kingships, such as the King of Allach, the over-king of the northern Ineal, which are difficult to represent in CK2's vassalage system. Creating structures which could contain the families eligible to succession to such over-kingships is maybe getting a bit too involved in the minutiae of medieval Irish politics, but it might make for an interesting mod. It looks like Ireland is going to get a large reduction in the number of playable provinces or counties from 19 down to 12, but these will be broken up into a massive amount of baronies. Leinster will have 6, meaning that there will be plenty of room to shove the various branches of the Dunlina. With just 12 counties, however, there will be less than were available in CK2 at its launch in 2012. In this map of Ireland, at the 1066 start taken from footage recorded by IGN, each flag represents a playable county. Thomond and Ormond are held by a single ruler, forming Munster. The southern Ineal lands, the Kingdom of Meath, are completely gone, having been absorbed into Dublin, Breffni, Oriel and Athlone. Connacht is now just a single county like it was in CK2 at launch, and Tyrconnell and Tyrone have been merged to form Allach. While DLC and patches added more counties to Ireland and the rest of the world over time in CK2, CK3 is already starting with a massive 45% worldwide increase, though the number in the British and Irish Isles has remained static. At the moment, it looks like a number of counties have been taken from Ireland and added to Britain. But this time they took 7. With the increase in holdings per county and new mechanics like vassal contracts, we'll have to just wait and see how a downsized Ireland plays out. In the next episode, I'm going to look at the 867 start, when the Vikings were patched into Ireland, creating upheaval and political instability. If you've any questions on the topics I've covered here, leave them in the comments below, and tell me if I should cover both the historical and gameplay elements in a single video or break them out. I will link to some videos below about Ireland and the late Roman Empire and other resources on medieval Irish history, and most importantly, you'll find links to my social media. Check me out on Twitter and Twitch. Thank you for joining me on this episode. It was a long one. I don't think the rest will be as long, as we won't have to do a big tour of the country and look at everyone's parents. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you will join me for the next one on Ireland in the Viking Age.